Scout came out of the trees, without my daughter. At first, I did not recognize him. The little dog crossing the far edge of the parking lot looked nothing like the nervous beagle mix who slept with one paw touching June's bedroom door. His chest was black with mud. One side of his harness hung loose where a strap had torn. He stumbled twice on the asphalt, caught himself, and kept coming. My sister had called me less than an hour earlier, pretending to fight back tears. "Your daughter wandered off," Heather had said. "We searched everywhere, Natalie. We can't find her." Now the official search had barely begun. Rangers were still unfolding maps across the hood of a truck. Volunteers were being told not to enter the woods alone. My breath showed under the parking lot lights. Scout was coming back by himself. "Scout!" I screamed. His head lifted. For 1 second, he looked past me, as if he expected June to be standing at my shoulder. Then he ran. Heather stepped in front of me. "That stupid dog," she said. "I told you he was the reason she ran off." Scout swerved around her. That was when I saw the yellow pouch tied to what remained of his harness. It was the little canvas bag June used when she played treasure hunt in our living room. One corner was dark with blood. A black strap hung through the opening. Heather saw it too. Her face changed. Not much. Most people would have missed it. Her mouth stopped trembling. Her shoulders went still. The panic she had been performing disappeared so completely that it was like watching someone switch off a light. She reached for Scout before I could. "Give me that," she said. I caught her wrist. Scout pressed himself against my legs, shaking so hard that his metal tag clicked against the buckle. He could not track on command, and had failed obedience class because every time June walked away, he followed her. But he knew one thing. I crouched until my face was level with his. "What did she send me?" I whispered. Scout lowered his head and pushed the yellow pouch into my hands. Heather grabbed at it again. "Don't open that here," she snapped. "You could damage the memory card." Everything around us seemed to stop. The ranger beside me looked at the black strap. Then he looked at Heather. No one had said the object was a camera. No one had mentioned a memory card. I tightened both hands around the pouch. Scout collapsed against my knees. His paws scraped raw. His whole body pointed toward the dark western tree line. Heather had spent the last 40 minutes telling the searchers to ignore. That was the moment I understood two things. My daughter had not chased Scout into the woods. She had sent him back to me. And my sister had not lost June. She had sent her somewhere. Stay with me to learn what Heather sent my 7-year-old daughter into those woods to retrieve, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happened when the truth finally came out. 7 hours earlier, Scout had been carrying a sock through my kitchen, as if it were the most important job in the world. June followed him in her pajamas, trying not to laugh. "Take it to Mom, Scout." He placed the sock against my ankle, then stood there, with his tail wagging, waiting for me to follow him back to her room. That was the only command he performed every time. Scout had been returned to the shelter twice because he hated being alone, carried household objects, and followed anyone who walked away. June had looked through the kennel bars and understood him in a way the adults had not. She said he was not stealing things. He was asking people to come back. After my divorce, June became afraid to leave her bedroom when I was downstairs. She began sending Scout to me with socks, pencils, and folded scraps of paper. I would ask, "What did she send me?" and follow him back. What began as a game became a private language among the three of us. That Saturday, June had been awake before sunrise because her school was holding Family Nature Day at Black Hollow Nature Preserve. She asked me 3 times to come, but an emergency staffing shortage at the bus dispatch center left me covering the weekend shift. "I'll be home before dinner," I promised as I packed her canvas day bag with a fleece jacket, water bottle, snack, safety whistle, Scout's folding bowl, and his old gray backup leash. Scout was already wearing his blue waist lead clipped to his harness. "You stay with Aunt Heather, and you do exactly what she says. Heather arrived 10 minutes early, walked in without knocking, checked the weather, and reminded June to use the bathroom. During the worst year of my divorce, Heather picked June up from school, sat through her nightmares, and covered evenings when my job would not let me leave. Her help had been real, and so was the gratitude that kept me from questioning her as often as I should have. A fresh scratch crossed Heather's wrist, and dried red clay marked the edge of one cuff. I assumed she had been rushing through another busy morning. When Scout brought her one of June's gloves, Heather laughed and pushed it away with her shoe. "That little dog can't track, guard, or stay when he's told," she said. "All he does is carry junk back to you." June hugged Scout around the neck. "He knows how to find Mom." Heather smiled at me over June's head. "Good thing I'm the one doing the useful work today." Mason waited in Heather's SUV. Usually restless, he kept his eyes on his phone. I noticed a fresh scratch on his forearm when he reached across to open the back door for June. "He wiped out at practice," Heather said before I asked. I accepted it because accepting Heather's answers was a family habit. At the preserve, I signed the guardian authorization that allowed her to supervise June during the event. Heather tucked the paper into her bag and gave me a look that was half affection, half reminder. "I've got her," she said. Like always. I thanked her again. The rest of that afternoon came back to me later, through June's account, the school's records, and the timestamps I would eventually lay across my dining table. For most of Family Nature Day, Heather stayed near the public trails, photographed June examining leaves, and spoke calmly with teachers. Then, shortly before 3, her phone lit up. June said Heather read the message twice. Her smile disappeared, and from that moment on, she kept checking the time. At 3:10, Heather signed June out of the school's supervision, telling the coordinator she was taking her home early because she looked tired. Instead, she drove to the Western Overflow picnic area, far from the families packing up near the visitor center. There, she gave June a hand-drawn map, covered with stars and arrows. The path ended near maintenance marker W14. Heather said a little black box was hidden near the culvert and would complete a surprise for me. She handed June the yellow treasure pouch from our living room games. "Put the black box in here and bring it only to me," she said. "Don't tell anyone, especially your mom, or you'll ruin the surprise." June asked if Scout could come. Heather looked down at the 18-pound dog she had mocked that morning and agreed. To her, he was harmless, too small to protect June and too foolish to carry anything that mattered. Heather stayed beside her vehicle, while June and Scout walked toward the closed Western Service Road. A low chain stretched across the entrance beneath a weathered sign, warning visitors to stay out. June ducked under it. Scout followed, then stopped and looked back. June called him softly and kept walking. Scout turned away from Heather's car and disappeared after my daughter between the trees. At 3:10, my sister had signed June out of the school's care. 12 minutes later, she sent her past a closed trail sign with a map no child had drawn. At 3:22 that afternoon, I was standing beneath the fluorescent lights of the dispatch center, trying to keep 42 city buses moving around a wreck on Route 11. One driver had missed a detour, 2 others were reporting different closure points, and a line of impatient passengers was building outside the hospital. I wrote each time and location on the whiteboard until the contradictions narrowed into one usable route. I had spent years learning that emergencies became manageable only when people stopped saying, "a little while ago," and started giving exact times. That afternoon, I applied that rule to buses. I did not yet know I would soon have to apply it to my sister. During a brief lull, I texted Heather and asked for a picture of June. I wanted to see her muddy shoes, Scout pulling towards some interesting smell, or the proud smile she wore whenever she completed a school activity without me hovering nearby. Heather replied several minutes later. "Reception is terrible. We're packing up now. I'll send one when we're on the road." I accepted the answer and returned to the route board. By then, Heather had already signed June out of the school's care and driven her to the western overflow lot. Everything that happened beyond that point came to me, later through June's simple account, the time records, and the pieces investigators recovered. I did not see my daughter enter the woods, but I eventually understood every choice that placed her there. June later told me the map looked as if Heather had made it especially for her. Blue stars marked the turns. Red arrows pointed past a picnic shelter and toward a narrow road hidden behind trees. At the bottom, Heather had drawn a treasure chest beside the number W14. So some of the markings were not childish at all. The number matched a maintenance culvert, and several arrows copied symbols posted beyond the low chain closing the western service road. June could not have invented them from the public family map. Heather had shown her exactly which restricted area to enter, but not exactly where the black box lay. Scout stopped at the chain and looked back toward the overflow lot. June called him, then ducked beneath it. She wanted to do the surprise correctly. Heather had told her I would be proud if she followed every clue and brought the treasure only to her. That was how my sister used June's best quality against her. My daughter did not enter the woods because she was reckless. She entered because an adult she trusted had given her instructions and made obedience sound like love. The stars led her along the edge of the drainage, cut to maintenance marker W14. June searched beneath fallen branches and around the concrete culvert. She grew worried when she did not immediately find anything. Scout kept moving a few feet ahead, then turning back to check on her, just as he always did on walks. The camera was not sitting in the open, and the map did not pinpoint its exact position. June found it because she crouched near a broken fern, and the low afternoon sun flashed against the exposed rim of a lens beneath the leaves. She reached under the branch, pulled out a small black action camera, and placed it inside the yellow pouch. She should have turned around then. Instead, she heard a faint tapping from below the trail. At first, she thought it was a woodpecker. Then a man called out, so weakly that she almost missed it beneath the wind moving through the trees. She followed the sound to the edge of a shallow ravine and saw Elias Reed lying against a fallen log. His lower leg bent at an angle that frightened her. Blood had dried along one side of his face, but a fresh line still ran from his scalp toward his collar. He told June not to come down. She tried to move close enough to give him her water bottle, slipped on loose soil, and landed hard on one ankle. June could still crawl, but climbing back to the trail became impossible. She gave Elias small drinks of water and laid her fleece across his chest when he began shivering. She blew the safety whistle I had packed, 3 short blasts at a time, but the ravine swallowed the sound. The public activity area was too far east, and the wind carried the whistle deeper into the trees. When Elias reached for her, his bloodied fingers caught the corner of the yellow pouch. Later, while June secured the camera inside, the fabric brushed his sleeve. That was the blood I would see when Scout finally returned. It did not belong to June, but I would not know that for hours. Back at the overflow lot, Heather waited for the quick return she had planned. When June failed to appear, she walked only the first stretch of the service road and called her name. She did not go as far as W14. Phone records later showed that at 4:25 she called Mason, not emergency services. He asked whether June had found the camera. Heather did not answer that question directly. She told him to move the ATV before anyone began searching the western road. 10 minutes later, she began building the story she would eventually tell me. She opened the canvas day bag I had packed that morning, removed Scout's old gray backup leash, and carried it toward the eastern lake path. Scout had never worn that leash that day. His blue waist lead had been clipped to his harness when they left my house. Heather placed the gray leash where a volunteer might find it, and concluded that Scout had pulled free near the water. She chose the lake because the lie contained pieces of truth. Scout liked water at our neighborhood park. He chased squirrels when excited. He had once slipped through an open gate. Each fact made the false story easier to believe. The school event ended while Heather drove between the public area and the overflow lot. Teachers had no reason to look for June because Heather's signature showed she had taken her home. To anyone who saw her moving between parking areas, she appeared to be a worried aunt searching for a child who had wandered away. But she did not activate an official search. She did not call me. She did not tell anyone that she had sent June past the chain or that the map ended near W14. At the dispatch center, I finished rerouting the last delayed bus shortly after 5. I checked my phone and saw no photograph. I sent Heather another message. This time she did not reply. At 5:35, my phone rang. Heather was breathing hard. Wind scraped across the receiver, and voices moved somewhere behind her. "Natalie, don't panic." My hand tightened around the phone. "Where's June?" There was a pause long enough for me to hear her swallow. Then she said the words that would divide my life into before and after. "Your daughter wandered off. We searched everywhere, but she's gone." I asked when she had last seen her. "Not long ago. Maybe an hour." Scout slipped away and June ran after him before I could stop her. An hour would have placed the disappearance around 4:35. Heather had signed June out at 3:10 and sent her toward the service road 12 minutes later, but I did not know that yet. "Have the rangers closed the entrances?" I asked. "Who is coordinating the search?" Heather began crying harder. "People are looking, just get here." I grabbed my keys and called Black Hollow myself while running toward the employee exit. The woman who answered transferred me to Ranger Luis Ortega. I gave him June's name, age, clothing, and the last location Heather had mentioned. He interrupted me gently. "Ma'am, we have not received a missing child report." I stopped beside my car, unable to understand him. "My sister said they've searched everywhere." "No official search has been activated," he said. "I'm initiating one now." Heather had waited more than 2 hours to call me, and until my own call, no one responsible for finding my daughter had known she was missing. By the time I reached Black Hollow, dusk had begun swallowing the trees. Ranger trucks blocked half the entrance, their lights washing the wet pavement in flashes of amber and white. A folding table had been set beneath the visitor center awning, and volunteers stood in small groups while a ranger marked sections of the preserve on a map. Heather ran toward me before I had fully closed my car door. Her hair was damp, and tears streaked the makeup beneath her eyes. She wrapped both arms around me so tightly that I could not see her face. "I'm sorry," she said. Scout pulled away. June chased him before I could stop her. I pushed her back. "Where did you last see June?" "Near the restrooms." I only turned away for a second. Ranger Luis Ortega approached with a notebook in one hand. He was calm without being slow, the way experienced people become when everyone around them is panicking. "We need a recent photograph, a description of her clothing, and something carrying her scent," he said. "Most importantly, I need the exact last known location." I handed him the picture from my phone and described June's jeans, purple sneakers, and green fleece. Heather interrupted before I finished. "She might not be wearing the fleece. She said she was warm earlier." I looked at her. "It was in her day bag." Heather rubbed her forehead. "Then she probably took it." "I don't know, Natalie. Everything happened so fast." Ortega returned to the question of location. Heather pointed first toward the visitor center. "She was near the restroom." A teacher standing nearby shook her head slightly. Heather noticed and changed her answer. "Actually, someone may have seen her near the buses." Scout was restless, so June might have followed him toward the parking area. "Which parking area?" Ortega asked. Heather looked toward the dark line of trees east of the visitor center. "The lakeside. Scout loves water. Natalie can tell you." That part was true. At our neighborhood park, Scout always pulled toward the pond. He chased squirrels if June loosened her grip, and once he had slipped through our back gate because a rabbit crossed the alley. Every detail Heather offered belonged to the dog I knew. For several terrible minutes, I believed her. I imagined Scout jerking free, June running after him, both of them leaving the public path before Heather could react. I imagined my daughter too frightened to turn back without him. The story fit her love for that dog so well that fear filled every space where doubt might have formed. Ranger Ortega divided volunteers into pairs and directed the first search teams east. Heather stood beside him, repeating that the lake trails should be checked first. A woman wearing a school staff badge touched my arm. "Mrs. Brooks, may I speak to you?" Her name was Miss Price, one of June's teachers. She led me a few steps beneath the awning, where Heather could still see us, but could not hear every word over the rain beginning to tap against the metal roof. "Heather signed June out at 3:10, Miss Price said. She told us June was tired, and she was taking her home." I stared at her. Heather said June disappeared during the event. June was no longer in our group when the final activity began. We thought they had left together. I turned back toward my sister. She was speaking to Ortega, beside the map, pointing again toward the lake. "Heather." She looked at me, then at Miss Price. Something guarded appeared behind her panic. "You signed June out at 3:10? I said. "Why did you tell me she ran off during the school event?" I was confused. There were people everywhere, and I didn't think the paperwork mattered. "It matters because you said she disappeared an hour before you called me. I don't know exactly when it happened. You signed her out more than 2 hours before that call." Heather's expression hardened. "Are you really interrogating me while your daughter is missing?" The words struck exactly where she intended. Guilt rose before reason could stop it. June was somewhere in the cold, and I was standing beneath an awning arguing over forms. Then, a girl from June's class approached Miss Price. Her mother stood behind her with both hands on the child's shoulders. "I saw June before she left," the girl said. Her aunt gave her a treasure map. Heather answered before I could. "June made that herself. She was playing all afternoon." The girl frowned. "You gave her the folded paper and the yellow bag." Heather's eyes moved toward me. "It was a little game. Nothing dangerous." "What game?" I asked. "She wanted something fun to do before we left." "Where did you send her?" "I didn't send her anywhere. She stayed near the picnic area." Ranger Ortega joined us. "Which picnic area?" Heather hesitated, then pointed east again. "Near the lake trail." I looked at the path she indicated. The ground beside it was covered in pale gravel and wet brown leaves. Heather had a fresh scratch across her wrist, and dried red clay still marked the edge of her cuff. The Western Service Road crossed red clay. I knew because I had seen it on the preserve map while driving in. The Eastern Lake Trail did not. "What about the closed service road to the west?" I asked. Heather's head snapped toward me. "Why would she go there?" "I'm asking whether you took her near it." "No, stop wasting time." She followed Scout toward the water. Her anger came too quickly. Ortega noticed it too, but he did not challenge her. He simply wrote something in his notebook and asked where Mason was. "He got sick and went home," Heather said. "He had a headache." Her phone lit in her hand. The message appeared for less than a second before she turned the screen against her coat. "Did she get it? Mason?" I asked. Heather locked the phone. "He's worried about June." "Get what?" "I don't know what you saw." I took the event brochure from the folding table and found a pen. At work, vague accounts caused buses to remain stranded. I had learned to turn confusion into columns and times. Heather signed June out at 3:10. She claimed June disappeared around 4:35. She called me at 5:35. No official search began until after my call. Even using Heather's latest version, at least 90 minutes had passed with no clear account of where June had been or what Heather had done. Rain thickened beyond the awning. I pictured June's bare arms and remembered the fleece I had packed. I did not know she had laid it across an injured man's chest. I only knew the temperature was falling and my daughter did not have it. A volunteer hurried from the eastern path holding something gray. "We found this near the lake turnoff." Heather covered her mouth. "That's Scout's leash." The old gray leash hung from the volunteer's gloved hand. One section near the handle had been repaired with black stitching after Scout chewed through it as a puppy. I remembered folding it and placing it at the bottom of the canvas day bag that morning. Scout had left my house, wearing his blue waist lead clipped to his harness. That wasn't on him, I said. Heather looked at me. What? The gray leash was inside the bag. Scout was wearing the blue lead. It could have been changed later. By whom? I don't know. Maybe June. June could clip a leash to Scout's harness, but she had no reason to remove the blue lead, put it away, take out the backup, and then leave that leash on a path in the opposite direction from Heather's red clay stains. Ortega took the gray leash from the volunteer and sealed it in a clear bag. Heather stepped closer to me. You are focusing on details that don't matter. They matter if someone wanted us searching the wrong place. Her face went still. Before she could answer, a faint metallic clicking came from beyond the rows of parked cars. At first, I thought it was rain striking a loose sign. Then the sound came again, uneven and familiar. Scout's tags. Every head near the command table turned. He emerged from the western tree line alone, stumbling into the light with the yellow pouch tied to his torn harness and one corner of the fabric dark with blood. The faint clicking became the sound of Scout's tags striking the torn buckle of his harness. He staggered between the parked cars, his belly and legs streaked with red mud. Burrs clung to the fur beneath his chest, and every few steps one front paw folded beneath him. Heather moved first. That useless dog, she said, hurrying toward him. He came back without her. He must have left June out there. Scout lowered his body when she approached, then veered around her and kept moving toward me. He was not searching the parking lot at random. His ears lifted at my voice, and whatever strength he had left carried him across the last stretch of pavement. I dropped to my knees. One side of his blue lead was gone. The harness had torn near his shoulder, and the skin beneath it was rubbed raw. A yellow canvas pouch had been tied through the remaining strap. I recognized the faded stars June had drawn across the front, and the crooked patch I had sewn over one corner after Scout chewed it during one of their living room treasure hunts. A black strap protruded through the opening. One side of the fabric was dark with blood. Heather reached over my shoulder. "Give me the bag." I blocked her hand with my arm. Scout pressed himself against my legs, trembling so violently that his tags continued to click. I placed one hand against his chest. His heart hammered beneath my palm. "What did she send me?" I asked. Scout pushed his muzzle against the yellow pouch, then let his body sink onto the pavement. The command had never meant merely carrying an object. June would send him from her bedroom with a sock or a folded note, and I would follow him back to her. Scout had returned because she had told him to bring someone to her. Heather grabbed for the pouch again. "Natalie, stop! You don't know where he found that." I caught her wrist before she could touch it. "Neither do you." Her eyes fixed on the black strap. "Then don't open it. You could damage the memory card." Ranger Ortega, who had been approaching from the command table, stopped beside us. "What memory card?" he asked. Heather's mouth opened, but no answer came immediately. I looked down at the pouch. Most of the object remained hidden beneath the canvas. I could see only a narrow strip of black rubber and part of a mounting strap. No one had called it a camera. No one had even touched the contents. Heather pulled her arm free. "It looks like an action camera strap. Anyone could recognize it." "From that?" Ortega asked. She looked toward the search teams instead of answering him. "Illegal riders use those trails all the time. It could belong to anyone." Ortega put on a pair of gloves and asked me not to remove the object. Before handing it over, I photographed the pouch exactly as Scout had delivered it, including the knots, the blood stain, and the torn harness strap. My hands shook so badly that I had to take the pictures twice. Ortega sealed the pouch inside a clear evidence bag. Through the plastic, he eased the fabric open enough to confirm that a small action camera was inside, but he did not turn it on. Heather stepped closer. "That has nothing to do with June. Scout probably picked it up after he ran away." I stood slowly, one hand still resting on Scout's back. "You said June chased him." "She did." Then how did he come back carrying the treasure pouch you gave her? Heather's eyes moved toward the little girl from June's class, who still stood beneath the awning with her mother. I told you, June was playing. She tied this to Scout, I said. She used the command she only uses when she wants him to bring me something. He didn't leave her. She sent him. Heather shook her head. You're making a story out of a dog carrying junk. The same dog she had called useless that morning had returned with the first thing she was desperate to take from me. I crouched beside Scout again. His pads were scraped, but they were not coated in the dark mud found along the lake. Red clay had dried between his toes. Thorn burrs from the western service road tangled beneath his belly. When I leaned closer, I caught the faint smell of gasoline on the yellow pouch and one side of his harness. He wasn't near the lake, I said. Heather folded her arms. You can't know that. I know what lake mud looks like. This is red clay. Ortega knelt beside Scout but did not ask him to track or follow a scent. Scout was exhausted, not trained for search work, and treating him like a rescue dog would waste time he no longer had. I called June's name toward the western trees. Scout forced himself upright. He took several unsteady steps, pulling toward the closed service road, then collapsed onto his side. His chest rose and fell rapidly. That's enough, Ortega said. He's not taking us farther. Heather pointed toward the eastern trails. He could have crossed the whole preserve. We should keep searching the lake. No, I said. Scout would return to the last place he expected to find people he knew. He came back to the event parking area. He only ran to me after he heard my voice. Ortega studied the red clay on Scout, the yellow pouch, and the service road marked on the preserve map. Then he called the search team leaders back to the table. We're shifting the primary search west, he said. Closed maintenance road, culvert markers, and the drainage cut below them. Medical team goes with the first group. Heather stepped between him and the map. You're changing the whole search because of a dog? Because of physical evidence, Ortega replied. If the camera belongs to dirt bike riders, you're sending everyone in the wrong direction. Her insistence strengthened the fear already forming inside me. Heather had spent hours pushing searchers toward the lake. Now that Scout had returned from the west carrying an object she recognized, she wanted the western road ignored more than ever. The first team reached the low service chain within minutes. I followed until Ortega stopped me at the edge of the restricted path. You stay where we can find you, he said. If June hears her mother's voice, we'll call you forward. The searchers moved beneath the chain and disappeared among the trees. Their flashlights flickered across the red clay road. Rain had softened the ground enough to preserve overlapping impressions. One ranger called back that he had found tire tracks wider than those of a bicycle. Another found a strip of yellow fabric caught on a broken branch near the chain. I recognized it before he carried it into the light. It was the ribbon June had worn around her ponytail that morning. Heather turned away. The tracks continued toward the maintenance culvert, then cut sharply across the road as if a heavy vehicle had been moved after the rain began. Beneath the trail, a ranger found a small smear of blood on a rock leading down toward the drainage ravine. My knees weakened. The pouch was bloody, I said. Now there's blood on the rock. Ortega faced me directly. We do not know whose blood either stain belongs to. Do not assume it is June's. Then whose is it? His expression changed as he looked down the steep slope. There may be someone else injured out there. The searchers spread along the western road, calling June's name and listening between each shout. The rain softened to a cold mist. For several seconds, the forest answered only with dripping leaves and the movement of boots through brush. Then, 3 weak whistle blasts rose from somewhere below the service road. They stopped. After a breathless pause, the same pattern came again. 3 short blasts from the ravine, exactly the way I had taught my daughter to call for help. The whistle came again from below the service road. 3 short blasts weakened by distance and rain. Every rescuer stopped moving long enough to hear where the sound returned from. Ranger Ortega raised one hand, and the calls through the woods fell silent. A searcher farther north shouted that he had heard it to his left. Another, standing near maintenance marker W14, pointed toward the drainage cut. Ortega marked both positions on the map, then sent 2 teams along the edge of the ravine to narrow the source without trampling the slope above it. I stepped toward the chain, but he blocked me with one arm. "The ground is unstable," he said. "We need you here where she can hear you." Heather stood several yards behind us, pale beneath the parking lights. She had stopped telling people to search the lake. Now she watched the western trees as if she were waiting to learn how much they would give back. Ortega guided me closer to the edge of the service road. Rain slid from my hair into my eyes. The ravine below was almost invisible, beyond the first row of wet branches. "Call her," he said. "Use something only she would recognize." I cupped my hands around my mouth. "June, Mom always comes back." The words had begun during my divorce, when June would wake and ask whether I might disappear while she slept. I had repeated them from dark hallways, outside bathroom doors, and across crowded schoolyards whenever she lost sight of me. For several seconds, only the rain answered. Then a faint whistle rose from below. 3 short blasts. "She heard you," Ortega said. I called again. "Stay where you are, baby. They're coming to you." A child's voice floated through the trees, too weak for me to understand, but it was June. The sound broke something open inside my chest. I had spent hours imagining silence because silence could mean anything. Her voice meant she was alive, cold and frightened, waiting at the bottom of a ravine because someone she trusted had sent her there. The rescue team anchored ropes to 2 trees and descended with medical packs and a rigid basket. Loose stones rolled beneath their boots. One rescuer called down that help was coming. Another asked how many people were below. 2, a voice answered. The word did not belong to June. Ortega looked at the blood on the rock, then toward the sealed yellow pouch resting beside the command table. There was another victim in the woods, exactly as he had feared. The first radio report came minutes later. "We have the child, conscious and responsive. Second patient is an adult male with significant leg trauma." My knees weakened. But Ortega kept one hand near my elbow, without pulling me away from the edge. The rescuers found June sitting beside an older man at the base of a fallen log. Her green fleece was spread across his chest. One of her hands rested on his sleeve, and the other held the safety whistle. She had kept telling him that her mother would come because she was afraid he would close his eyes and stop answering her. June had scrapes on both palms and mud across her jeans. Her ankle had swollen inside one purple sneaker, and she could not put her full weight on it. She was cold and dehydrated, but conscious. There was no serious bleeding from her or Scout. The man beside her was Elias Reed, a 67-year-old volunteer who maintained the preserve's drainage markers. His lower leg appeared fractured. Every breath caused pain along his ribs, and blood from a scalp wound had dried into his collar. The rescuers believed he had been exposed for hours. Later, June told me that after finding the black box beneath a broken fern, she heard Elias tapping his metal water bottle against a rock. She followed the sound to the ravine. He warned her not to climb down, but she tried to get close enough to pass him her water and slipped on the loose soil. Once she realized she could not climb out, she stayed. She gave him small drinks, placed her fleece over him, and blew the whistle in groups of 3. When no one answered, she put the camera inside the yellow pouch. Elias's bloodied hand and sleeve touched one corner while she worked, which explained the stain Scout carried back. Later testing would confirm the blood belonged to Elias. June used the simple knot she practiced during their treasure games to secure the pouch to Scout's damaged harness. Scout would not leave her at first. He sat against her leg, whining and looking between her and the slope. She gave the command once, "Take it to Mom." He stayed. Then June pointed up the ravine and tried again. "Take it to Mom. Bring her back." Scout finally climbed away from her. He had not known how to rescue anyone. He had only understood that June was sending something to me, and that when he completed the task, I always followed him back. The rescuers secured Elias first, so he would not slide farther down the wet slope. When they had June in a safety harness and the edge was stable, Ortega allowed me past the chain. I reached the ravine as they lifted her toward the road. Her lips had lost their color, and wet strands of hair clung to her face. She looked smaller inside the rescue harness than she had that morning in my kitchen. "Mom, I'm here." I did not give her a speech. I wrapped both hands around her face, felt her breath against my wrist, and pressed my forehead to hers. She grabbed the front of my coat and held on while a medic covered her with a thermal blanket. "I knew Scout would find you," she whispered. "He did. Is he hurt?" "His paws are sore, but he came back." Her body loosened slightly against mine. Behind us, Heather called her name. "June, sweetheart, I'm here." June turned toward the voice. The moment she saw Heather approaching, she recoiled so sharply that the medic steadied her injured ankle. "Don't let her take the black box," she said. Heather stopped. "What black box, honey?" she asked, making her voice soft. "You're confused because you're cold." June gripped my coat more tightly. "The treasure." I placed myself between them. "Do not question her." "Natalie, I'm trying to calm her. You will stay away from my daughter." Heather's face changed. "She needs family right now." "She has me." Ortega stepped between us before Heather could move closer. He told her she would be interviewed separately and directed another ranger to remain with her. June looked up at me. "Did Scout bring it?" "Yes." She released a breath that trembled through her whole body. "Aunt Heather said it was your surprise," she said. "She said I had to give it only to her." Heather spoke from behind Ortega. "She misunderstood a game." June shook her head. She showed me the number on the map. The rescuers brought Elias up in the basket. He drifted in and out of awareness while medics checked his breathing and covered his injured leg. As they moved him toward the ambulance, his eyes opened and fixed briefly on Ortega. "The boy," he murmured. Ortega leaned closer. "What boy?" "On the ATV." His eyes closed before he could say more. Heather made a small sound behind me. When I looked at her, she was staring at Elias, not with surprise, but recognition she could not hide quickly enough. Ortega noticed. He said nothing and followed the stretcher. 2 ambulances waited near the visitor center. One would take Elias to the regional trauma unit. The other would take June to the nearest hospital for imaging and treatment for exposure. Part of me wanted to stay and demand answers. I wanted Heather's phone taken, the camera opened, and every minute of her story challenged before she could change it again. But June's hand had not left my sleeve. I climbed into her ambulance. Heather called after me that we needed to talk. I did not turn around. The camera was protected. Ortega had the sign out time, and Scout had already destroyed the lie that sent the searchers east. My place was beside the child, who had spent hours wondering why no adult had followed the path her aunt had chosen. June remained quiet while the medic wrapped her ankle and warmed her with heated blankets. After several miles, she looked toward the rear doors. Why didn't Aunt Heather come down the path after me? I could not tell her that Heather had been protecting something more important to her than June's safety. I did not yet know the full truth myself. "I don't know," I said, "but you did the right thing when you sent Scout." At the hospital, a nurse moved June into a private treatment room. I stayed beside the bed while they checked her temperature and prepared to take her for an X-ray. She watched the door until it closed, then reached for my sleeve again. "Aunt Heather told me nobody could know about the black box," she whispered. "Not even you." The doctor confirmed that June had mild hypothermia, dehydration, a sprained ankle, and several superficial cuts on her hands and knees. Nothing required surgery, but they wanted to keep her overnight to monitor her temperature and make sure the fall had not caused a hidden injury. June listened without complaint until the doctor mentioned that she would need crutches for several days. Then she asked whether Scout was allowed to visit. I told her he was at an emergency veterinary clinic. A volunteer had driven him there after the rescue team examined his paws. One pad needed stitches, and the torn harness had rubbed a raw line beneath his shoulder, but the veterinarian expected him to recover. The clinic called while a nurse helped June drink warm broth. The veterinarian said Scout was exhausted and frightened, not seriously injured. She also made something clear that mattered to me. He is not a trained search or rescue dog, she said. He probably followed a familiar route back toward the activity area, then responded to your voice. Whatever he carried home was learned behavior, not specialized training. That made what Scout had done feel even more extraordinary. He had not understood the size of the forest or the danger at the bottom of the ravine. He had understood June's command and the promise that I always followed him back. Ranger Ortega stopped by long enough to tell me Elias had reached the regional trauma center. Doctors were treating a broken leg, cracked ribs, a scalp wound, and a concussion. He was stable, but investigators would have to wait before taking a full statement. The camera remained sealed. Ortega would not turn it on until it could be documented and handled properly. We already have enough to know your sister's account is incomplete, he said, but incomplete is not the same as proven. I understood what he meant. Heather had lied about where June disappeared and delayed reporting her missing. Scout had returned with an object she recognized. Those facts were powerful, but they did not yet explain what the camera contained or why Heather had sent June after it. My mother called soon after Ortega left. Gloria was crying so hard that I could barely understand her. Heather is outside the hospital, she said. Please let her see June. Whatever happened, she loves that child. I looked through the glass panel in the door. June lay beneath warmed blankets, her injured ankle elevated, her eyes following every person who passed in the corridor. She is afraid of Heather. She's confused and exhausted. Don't tear the family apart before anyone knows the truth. For most of my life, those words had worked on me. They had taught me to absorb discomfort so everyone else could remain comfortable. That night, I agreed only to a brief visit while I stayed in the room. Heather entered carrying a stuffed fox from the gift shop. She looked freshly washed, but the scratch across her wrist remained visible. She set the toy near June's pillow and reached for her hand. June pulled it beneath the blanket. Heather's face tightened, then softened again. You gave everyone such a scare. June looked at me instead of answering. Heather sat beside the bed. Scout ran first, remember? You went after him because you were worried. June shook her head. He was with me. You were frightened. Things can get mixed up when you're cold. I followed the map. Heather gave a small, patient laugh. The map you made because you wanted an adventure. I didn't make it. You wrote your name on it. You drew the arrows. Heather glanced at me. She has been through a trauma. You shouldn't encourage her to blame people. I remained near the foot of the bed. Ask her how she feels. Do not tell her what happened. Heather leaned closer to June and lowered her voice. Nobody is blaming you, sweetheart. We only need to make sure they understand Scout ran away first. June's mouth trembled. He didn't. If they think a dog caused a child to fall into a ravine, they may decide he isn't safe. Animal control could take him somewhere you can't visit. June's breathing changed. She looked at me in terror. Mom, are they taking Scout? I crossed the room and moved between Heather and the bed. Get out. Heather stood. I was trying to protect her. You threatened a 7-year-old with losing her dog, so she would repeat your story. That is not what I said. You will not speak to June alone again. Heather's concern vanished. You cannot keep me from my own niece. I am her mother. Watch me. A security officer escorted Heather into the corridor. She protested loudly enough for everyone near the nurse's station to hear that I was emotional and turning June against her. I closed the door. June was crying now. I told Scout to go. Is that why they'll take him? I sat beside her and held both of her hands. No one is taking Scout because you asked him for help. You did exactly the right thing. But Aunt Heather said it was a secret. Adults do not ask children to hide danger from their parents. A surprise ends with something happy. A secret that makes you scared or keeps someone from helping you is not yours to protect. June stared at our joined hands. She said the black box was for you. I know. But she said I had to give it only to her. That was her lie, not yours. A knock came at the door. Miss Price entered with Ranger Ortega. She carried a clear folder containing the school's sign-out sheet and the items removed from June's clothing during treatment. The form showed Heather's signature beside 3:10 p.m. It listed her as the adult, assuming sole responsibility for June after leaving the event. Inside another evidence sleeve was the muddy treasure map. June's name appeared at the top in purple crayon, but the route beneath it had been drawn with a straight edge. Distances were marked between turns. The arrows copied maintenance symbols, and the final star sat beside W14. Ortega placed the public Family Nature Day map next to it. The public map showed picnic shelters, restrooms, and open trails. It did not show culvert numbers or the service markers beyond the closed chain. Heather had remained in the corridor, and when she saw the documents through the open door, she stepped toward us. June must have copied those signs during the event. She could not see them from the public trails, Ortega said. She wanders ahead sometimes. I pointed to the sign-out form. You told the school you were taking her home. Then you handed her a completed map, leading beyond a closed road. Heather folded her arms. You have no proof I drew it. The child's name is in crayon, Ortega said. The measurements and marker codes are in adult handwriting. We will compare them. The elevator doors opened behind her. My mother emerged with Mason. He wore a hooded sweatshirt despite the warm hospital corridor, and fresh abrasions crossed one forearm. His face looked gray beneath the lights. He saw June through the glass, but did not ask about her ankle or whether she was warm. Does the camera still work? He asked. Heather spun toward him. Mason, stop talking. The corridor became quiet. Mason looked at his mother, then at the evidence sleeve containing the map. Ortega asked him to step into a separate consultation room. Heather objected immediately and told him not to answer anything without a lawyer. Her urgency was sharper than fear for June had ever been. Mason followed Ortega for several steps, then stopped beside my daughter's door. Through the glass, he watched June clutch the stuffed fox Heather had brought and push it away from her body. His eyes filled. I didn't know she was going to send June, he whispered. Heather moved toward him. Don't say another word. I stepped between them. Who was hurt this morning? Mason's gaze stayed on June. The man in the ravine, he said. He was alive when Mom got there. My mother covered her mouth. Heather told Mason he was confused, but he shook his head. I wanted to call for help. I asked him why he had not. Mason finally looked at his mother. I told her to call 911. She said one call would ruin my life. Mason's confession did not come all at once. After he said Elias had been alive when Heather arrived, Ranger Ortega stopped asking questions until a juvenile investigator and an advocate could be present. Heather demanded that Mason leave with her, but he refused to move from the chair outside June's room. By the following morning, June's temperature had stabilized, and the swelling in her ankle had begun to ease. While she slept, Mason agreed to repeat his account in a small consultation room with the appropriate adults present. I attended because his actions had led directly to what happened to my daughter. Mason stared at the floor as he admitted taking the ATV without permission before the preserve opened. The Western Service Road was closed, but he had ridden there before and believed no one would see him that early. He had strapped the action camera to his chest because he wanted footage of himself driving fast along the maintenance route. He looked down when his phone vibrated. When he raised his head, Elias was directly ahead. I hit the brake, Mason said. It was too late. The ATV struck Elias and threw him down the drainage slope. Mason fell to one side, and the camera tore free from its mount. He heard Elias groaning below the road, but panic took control before he climbed down. He called Heather. She got there fast, he said. She told me to move the ATV away from the public trail while she looked for the camera. Heather sat beside her attorney, her face rigid. He was 16 and terrified. He was not thinking clearly. Mason admitted he left the scene. He also admitted returning during the search for June and moving the ATV again after Heather sent him a message. Heather interrupted. He believed he was protecting himself from being blamed for an accident. An injured man was lying in a ravine, I said. She thought trail workers would find him, Gloria replied from the end of the table. Or that he was already beyond help. No one knew how badly he was hurt. Mason lowered his head. The first camera file had already been recovered. Ortega did not play the sound from the later clips, but he showed us the confirmed impact footage on a department laptop. The image shook as Mason rode beneath the closed road sign. His phone lit near the bottom of the frame. He looked down for less than 2 seconds. When the view lifted again, Elias turned toward the sound of the ATV. Mason shouted. The picture lurched, and the camera tumbled into brush. The screen went dark beneath leaves, but the recording continued. Heather pointed toward the frozen image. That proves what Mason told you. He made a terrible mistake and panicked. My involvement began after the accident. You searched for the camera instead of reporting the collision, I said. I did not know Elias's condition. You knew where he was. I believed someone would find him. Gloria reached across the table toward me. Natalie, Mason's accident and June getting lost are 2 separate things. You have your daughter back. Elias is alive. 2 children should not lose their futures over one awful day. I looked at Mason. He was responsible for looking at his phone, striking Elias, leaving the scene and later moving the ATV. But June had not wandered into his accident by chance. Heather made them the same thing, I said. She sent June to recover the evidence. Heather leaned forward. You cannot prove I knew what was on that camera. You drew a map to the place where it fell. It led to an area, not the camera. That makes it worse. You sent a 7-year-old to search a restricted drainage road because you were unwilling to go back yourself. A phone on the table vibrated. Ortega answered, listened, and wrote several words in his notebook. Investigators had located the ATV inside a relative's storage shed 12 miles from Black Hollow. Red clay remained beneath the frame. Damage to the front assembly and transfer marks matched material collected near the impact site. The relative said Mason had brought it there during the search and asked to leave it overnight. Ortega then placed a printed message record on the table. At 4:40, while June was already missing, Heather had written to Mason, "Move it now. They are searching." Heather looked at her attorney. I was afraid they would assume the ATV caused June's disappearance. No one knew about the ATV, Ortega said. She did not answer. That afternoon, I returned to June's room with copies of the school sign-out record, the call log times Ortega was permitted to share, and the distance marked on the preserve map. I spread them across the rolling table beside her bed. At work, I built timelines because one false time could send a bus into a closed intersection. Here, every false time had sent people away from my child. The collision happened shortly after 7 in the morning. Heather reached the preserve minutes later. At 3:10, she signed June out of school supervision. At 3:22, she gave June the map. When June failed to return, Heather called Mason at 4:25. At 4:40, she told him to move the ATV. At 5:35, she called me. The official search began only after I contacted the preserve. Heather had not made one frightened decision. The timeline showed a chain of moments when she could have stopped. She could have called for Elias. She could have told the school where she was taking June. She could have followed the map herself when June failed to return. She could have directed the rangers toward W14. Instead, each delay protected the previous lie and created a new danger. June woke while I was writing the times in a straight column. She watched me for a moment, then asked whether Mason had left the man in the ravine. Yes, I said. The adults are finding out exactly what happened. Her eyes moved to the muddy map inside its evidence sleeve. I shouldn't have gone under the chain. You followed instructions from an adult you trusted, but I knew the sign said closed. You are 7. Heather designed the choice so that obeying her meant breaking the rule. That responsibility belongs to her, not you. June pressed her lips together. If I hadn't found the camera, Scout wouldn't be hurt. If Heather had not sent you, neither of you would have been there. She looked toward the empty space beside the bed where she wanted Scout to be. I held her hand until the guilt loosened enough for her to close her eyes again. Mason asked to speak with me before leaving the hospital. His advocate remained nearby. He told me this was not the first time Heather had protected him from reckless riding. Months earlier, he had damaged a fence after taking a dirt bike onto private land. Heather paid for the repairs and told the owner someone else had been riding. Mason never faced the restriction he had been warned about. She always said she could fix it, he whispered. I thought she could fix this too. Heather appeared at the end of the corridor and called his name. Mason flinched before turning toward her. She still described herself as a mother protecting her son from a single mistake. Gloria wanted to believe that version because it left room for forgiveness without asking what forgiveness would cost June. Ranger Ortega returned after sunset. He told me the camera had saved the impact in ordinary 5-minute files. Its battery had already been low, so it recorded 4 complete segments and 1 final partial segment before shutting down. Nothing from the afternoon had been recorded, and the morning files had not been overwritten. The impact was only the first clip, he said. I asked what the remaining files contained. Ortega glanced through the window at June, asleep beneath the hospital blanket. The second clip begins with your sister checking his pulse. Ranger Ortega played the recovered audio in a small interview room at the hospital. The screen on the department laptop remained dark because the camera had landed beneath leaves, but the microphone had kept recording. I sat beside the window with both hands locked around a paper cup I had forgotten to drink from. Heather sat across the table with her attorney. Gloria was beside her, as if physical closeness might still hold our family together. The first sound was Mason breathing too fast. Leaves cracked beneath his shoes, followed by the scrape of loose stones sliding down the ravine. Is he dead? Mason asked. Heather told him to stay near the road. Her voice on the recording was steadier than his, impatient rather than frightened. Branches moved against the microphone as she climbed down toward Elias. For several seconds, all we heard was her breathing and the wet rustle of leaves. Then Elias groaned. Heather said, He's breathing. The paper cup bent beneath my fingers. Mason began crying. Then call 911. Mom, we have to call. There was a pause, followed by Heather moving through the brush near the camera. We find the camera first, she said. Then we call. No one in the room moved. The sentence was not shouted in panic. Heather spoke as if she were deciding the order of 2 errands. The recording continued. Mason searched near the ATV while Heather pushed through the brush. He asked twice whether they should go back to Elias. The first time, Heather told him to keep looking. The second time, she warned that if the footage reached the police, his previous riding incident would be reopened and his future would be over. Mason said he did not care about the video anymore. He wanted an ambulance. Heather answered that caring would not undo the crash. Finding the camera might still save him. For 22 minutes, they searched while Elias called weakly from below. Heather never gave his exact location to anyone. Near the end of the final file, Mason asked whether they were still going to call. Heather told him they would make the call from somewhere else after she had time to think. The battery died before any call was made. Ortega closed the laptop. Technical facts no longer mattered. I did not need another timestamp to understand what I had heard. Heather had reached an injured man, confirmed he was alive, and chosen a missing camera over his life. Hours later, when June failed to return, Heather made the same choice again. She knew where she had sent my daughter. She knew the map ended beside the ravine. Yet she delayed the search because finding June might also mean finding the camera. June had not been endangered by one plan that went wrong. Heather had placed her inside a decision already made that morning. Whenever another person's safety threatened Mason's future, Heather treated that life as something she could postpone. Ortega laid the supporting records beside the laptop. Heather's phone had connected to a tower covering the Western Preserve shortly after the collision. Mason had called her within minutes of the impact. The hand-drawn map used maintenance numbers unavailable on the public trail guide. Heather's signature removed June from school supervision, and her later statements directed rescuers east while every physical trace pointed west. None of those items replaced the audio. Together, they showed that Heather's conduct had not begun when June disappeared. The treasure hunt was the afternoon continuation of the choice recorded that morning. Heather asked to speak to me privately. Ortega allowed us to use an empty consultation room while her attorney waited outside the open door. The moment we were alone, Heather stopped crying. "I carried you through the divorce," she said. "I picked June up when you couldn't leave work. I sat with her when she woke screaming for her father. You would have lost your job without me." Everything she listed was true. That was why the betrayal reached so deeply. Her kindness had never felt like a loan until she demanded repayment with my silence. "I trusted you with my daughter because of those things," I said. "You used that trust to send her into a closed section of forest." Mason made a mistake. I was trying to keep one terrible morning from destroying his entire life. "You left Elias without help. He survived. You left June out there after she failed to return. She survived too." The ease with which she said it made me cold. Heather stepped closer. "You have both of them alive, and now you want revenge because you're angry. Mason should not lose everything because you need someone punished. This is not about what I need. It is exactly about that. You want to prove you were the better mother after all." I finally understood that protecting Mason was only part of her motive. Heather needed to remain the person who controlled what consequences reached our family and who absorbed them. She did not see June, Elias, or even Mason as people allowed to make moral choices outside her plan. Gloria joined me after Heather left the room. She had heard the recording, but she still asked whether the matter could be handled privately. "Elias is alive," she said. "June is safe. Mason can make restitution. We can get everyone help without tearing the family apart in public." Keeping it private is how Heather learned she could keep doing this. My mother looked down. She did not agree, but she could no longer deny the pattern. That evening, Heather tried a different approach. She called and said the school's insurance carrier would investigate why Scout had been at the event. She claimed administrators might say he was an uncontrolled animal and blame him for leading June beyond the trail. "He was allowed there," I said. "Can you prove that? If they decide he caused this, animal control may evaluate him. You know how those reports work." I ended the call, but the threat followed me into June's room. Scout had been discharged from the veterinary clinic and lay on a blanket beside her bed, one front paw bandaged and the raw place beneath his shoulder covered. June slept with her fingers curled into the fur near his neck. Heather sent an email before midnight. Attached was a prepared statement written as if it came from me. It claimed June had taken the map without permission, invented the treasure hunt, and chased Scout after he broke free. It said I had insisted he attend despite knowing he was unreliable around wildlife. Heather offered to pay June's medical bills and help cover my shifts while she recovered. All I had to do was sign before 9 the next morning. The final message arrived while I watched June breathe. "Sign it by 9 tomorrow, or I will make sure they take that dog away from her." Heather asked for one final family meeting before the 9 o'clock deadline on the statement she wanted me to sign. She chose our mother's house, the place where every disagreement in our family had eventually been softened into something we were expected to survive together. June remained at the hospital with a nurse she trusted, and Scout asleep beside her bed. I carried only copies of records I was permitted to have, and the timeline I had written myself. The original map, camera, messages, and physical evidence remained with investigators. I was not going to Gloria's house to prove a criminal case. I was going because Heather still believed she could make me choose family peace over my daughter. Heather sat at the dining table with her attorney's business card beside her phone. Gloria had made coffee no one touched. Mason stood near the window, His shoulders curved inward, as though he were trying to take up less space. The false statement lay in the center of the table. Heather pushed it toward me. This protects everyone without changing the fact that June is safe. The document said June had taken the map without permission, followed Scout beyond the marked trail, and found the camera by accident. It described Heather's delayed call as confusion caused by a chaotic school event. It placed Mason's crash in a separate paragraph, as if the collision and my daughter's disappearance had occurred in different worlds. "If you sign," Heather said, "the school can treat this as a supervision accident. Mason will still answer for the ATV, but they won't make it look like some planned attack on June." "You did plan to send her after the camera." "I planned a game. I expected her to walk a short distance and come back. You signed her out, took her away from the school group, and sent her under a closed road chain." Heather looked at Gloria. "This is what I meant. Natalie has decided I wanted June hurt." My mother reached across the table. "No one is saying that. We are trying to stop this from destroying what is left of the family." I opened my folder. The first page I placed on the table was the school sign-out form. Heather's signature appeared beside 3:10 p.m. The second was a photograph of the muddy treasure map, with its maintenance marker and measured turns. The third was the photograph I had taken of the yellow pouch tied to Scout's torn harness. The fourth was Heather's proposed statement. She stared at the 4 pages, as if their order offended her more than their contents. "You removed June from the school's protection," I said. "You gave her a route into a restricted area. When she did not return, you called Mason instead of calling for help. You sent him to move the ATV. You left a different leash near the lake and directed the search east. At the hospital, you frightened June with the idea that Scout would be taken away. Then you wrote this and asked me to repeat your lie." Heather folded her arms. "You keep turning everything into a conspiracy when this began, with Mason making a mistake. Mason's crash began with Mason. What happened to June began with you. I was protecting my son. You protected him by transferring the consequences to Elias, June, Scout, and me." Gloria closed her eyes. "Heather helped you when no one else did, Natalie. She cared for June through the divorce. She sat in that hospital when June had pneumonia. She changed her own schedule so you could keep your job. I remember all of it." Heather leaned forward, sensing an opening. I continued before she could speak. "Her kindness was real. So was what she did in those woods. One does not erase the other." The room went quiet. For years, gratitude had been the answer whenever I tried to set a boundary with Heather. If she had once saved me, then I was expected to keep granting her access, trust, and forgiveness. Saying aloud that both truths could exist removed the only shield she had left. Heather turned toward Mason. "Tell her you never asked me to involve June." Mason did not look at her. "Mason," she said again. He lifted his head. "You said using June would make it look innocent." Heather's chair scraped against the floor. "That is not what I said. You told me nobody would question a little girl looking for treasure. You said if she brought the camera back, people would think she found it while playing. You were panicking. You misunderstood me. You told me to move the ATV while she was still missing. I was trying to save your future." Mason's face tightened. "You kept saying you were saving me, but every time I wanted to tell the truth, you told me I was too weak to understand what it would cost." Heather stood and pointed at him. "You are weak. After everything I have done, you sit there and help them destroy you." Gloria rose from her chair. "Stop talking to him like that." Heather looked at our mother, as if she had been struck. Gloria's voice trembled, but she did not sit down. "He caused the accident. He must answer for it. You do not get to call control love just because you were afraid." It was not an apology for all the times Gloria had asked me to preserve peace. It was not enough to repair what had happened. But for the first time, she stopped building a wall around Heather's version of the family. Heather turned back to me. "When June realizes she lost her aunt, her cousin, and half her family because you refused one compromise, she will blame you." I looked at the statement between us. June was 7 when you asked her to carry your lie. I will not ask her to carry mine. I slid the unsigned pages back across the table. All of the records I have, including your email and thread about Scout, have already been submitted. I have also requested formal no-contact protection for June. You will not speak to her, visit her, send messages through anyone else, or use Mom to reach her. Heather stared at me. You cannot erase me. I am not erasing what you did. That is the difference. I gathered my folder and left before anyone could turn the moment into another argument. I did not wait to see whether Heather cried, shouted, or found a new explanation. I did not need the satisfaction of watching her lose control in that room. My daughter was waiting for me. Later that day, Ortega informed me that Heather had been taken for formal questioning. The investigation would address her use of June, the delayed and false reporting, the concealment of evidence, and her decision to leave Elias without help. No one promised me an immediate sentence or a perfect legal ending. Mason entered a separate juvenile process. His admission did not erase the crash, leaving Elias, or moving the ATV. He would face driving restrictions, restitution, and structured accountability. Telling the truth had not made him innocent. It had only ended his mother's control over what he was allowed to admit. I returned to the hospital after dark. Scout lifted his bandaged paw when I entered, then lowered his head again when he recognized me. June was asleep with one hand resting near his shoulder. I sat beside her and touched the hair away from her forehead. Her eyes opened slightly. Did you come back? I took her hand. Always. 3 months later, the yellow pouch still rested on the highest shelf in our living room. June wanted it close enough to see, but not where Scout could reach it. Neither of them was ready to treat it like an ordinary toy. The immediate danger had passed, but none of us had returned unchanged. June's ankle healed before the fear did. She sometimes woke calling Scout's name, then climbed out of bed to make sure he was still outside her door. Scout's paws recovered, and the fur grew back beneath his shoulder, but dense rows of trees made him stop so abruptly that his leash tightened between us. I learned not to pull. Heather remained under a no-contact order while the case moved forward. She could not visit June, call her, send gifts, or pass messages through family members. For the first time in my life, Heather no longer controlled how our relatives described what had happened. The records, the camera, and her own words had taken that power away from her. Mason admitted his responsibility in the juvenile process. He lost his driving privileges, entered a structured accountability program, and began working toward restitution for the damage he had caused. Telling the truth did not erase the moment he looked at his phone, left Elias in the ravine, or returned to move the ATV. It did mean his future was changed rather than declared worthless. He wrote June a short apology. I let her counselor read it first, then allowed June to decide whether she wanted it. She placed the envelope in a drawer without opening it. I did not ask her to forgive him before she understood what forgiveness meant to her. Elias spent weeks in rehabilitation after surgery on his leg. He still had pain when he breathed deeply, but he was walking with assistance and expected to return home. One afternoon, a card arrived in his uneven handwriting. June asked me to read it aloud. He thanked her for staying beside him when she was cold and frightened. He thanked her for sharing her water, for keeping him awake, and for being brave enough to send Scout away when she wanted him beside her. At the bottom he had written that courage did not always look like fighting. Sometimes it looked like trusting someone else to finish what you could not do alone. June folded the note carefully and kept it beside her bed. My mother began visiting once a week. Gloria did not arrive with speeches about family or requests that I understand Heather's pain. The first time she came, she stood in my kitchen and apologized for asking me to preserve peace, when the price had always been paid by the person with less power. I thought keeping everyone together was the same as protecting the family, she said. I see now that I was protecting the person causing the damage. I accepted the apology without pretending it repaired everything. Gloria's visits remained limited, and she was not allowed to discuss Heather's case with June. Trust returned in measured amounts, not because we shared blood, but because my mother respected every boundary I set. I changed our routines too. I adjusted my schedule at the dispatch center, arranged backup care with 2 licensed providers, and created a written list of adults allowed to collect June. No single relative would ever again become so essential that gratitude could be used as authority over my daughter. June began meeting with a counselor who understood childhood trauma. Some sessions went well. Others ended with June silent in the back seat, holding Scout's leash in both hands. One afternoon, she asked the question she had been carrying since the hospital. If I knew the sign said closed, was it still my fault for going under it? I pulled the car over before answering. You were responsible for trying to follow rules, I said. Heather was responsible for giving you instructions that made following her mean breaking one. Adults are supposed to make children safer, not use their trust against them. June stared through the windshield. What if someone says something is a secret? We have a new rule. Surprises are happy, and they always get shared eventually. Secrets about danger, touching, threats, or breaking rules go straight to mom, your counselor, a teacher, or another safe adult. Even if family tells me not to? Especially then. She nodded slowly. I could not remove what Heather had taught her about betrayal, but I could give her a language for recognizing it before it trapped her again. Scout needed his own kind of healing. We did not take him back to Black Hollow. I did not believe recovery required forcing him to stand where he had been afraid. We began with short walks in an open neighborhood park. There were trees along the edges, but no dense trails and no place where June could disappear from view. Scout stayed close to her, glancing back every few steps as if counting the distance between us. One quiet afternoon, June stopped to retie her shoe. Scout walked several feet ahead, noticed she was missing and froze. He turned around and waited. Before the woods, June might have apologized for slowing him down. Instead, she smiled. I'm coming, she said. Scout remained where he was, until she reached him. Then they continued together. That evening, June asked me to take down the yellow pouch. The canvas had been cleaned, but a faint stain remained near one corner. One strap was missing, and the old stitches had pulled apart where Scout's harness tore. June sat cross-legged on the living room floor with a needle, yellow thread, and more determination than skill. I helped her thread the needle, but let her make the repairs herself. The stitches crossed unevenly through the fabric, some too close together, and others leaving small gaps. I can buy you a new one, I said. June shook her head without looking up. No, this one knows the way home. Scout lay beside her, his chin resting near her knee. When she finished, June found a square of paper and wrote something with her purple pencil. She folded it twice and placed it inside the repaired pouch. For a moment, I expected her to fasten it to Scout's harness and give the command that had connected us for years. Instead, June stood, crossed the small distance between us, and placed the note directly in my hand. It read, "He came back because he knew you would come for us." I sat beside her on the floor. Scout shifted until his head rested across both our feet, touching June and me at the same time. The repaired pouch remained nearby, open and empty. No one asked him to carry anything. Scout had carried the truth out of the woods. What he brought back to us was something larger. He brought back the certainty that loyalty was not staying silent for the people you loved. Sometimes, it was leaving the person beside you because you trusted someone else to come. That evening, with June's hand in mine and Scout asleep across both our feet, nobody had to send for me. I was already home.